Hello and welcome to Joy in Our Town. I'm your host, Vanessa Rose. So happy that you decided to tune in and join us for another great edition today. We are here to speak with you about family, and we are joined today by Michael W. Smith, who is a Christian counselor and a radio host, amongst other things. He's a very involved person and does a lot to help our community. Thank you so much for being here, Michael.
Privileged to be back.
Appreciate you taking the time out of your day and away from patients and people to come and be here. But before we get started, if you wouldn't mind sharing with the viewing audience just a little bit about yourself and your history and what you do here in the Valley.
Yes, well, I've been a counselor here in Phoenix area for 31 years, and I retired in 2005 and changed my counseling practice a little bit. I went into Christian counseling, family counseling, and marriage and family counseling exclusively. That's kind of what I do now on a full-time basis.
Very neat. And also you host a radio show?
Yes, I have a couple of morning radio shows where I talk about family issues, psychology, counseling, therapy, inner healing, different subjects.
Wonderful. Well, I know that you are a book of knowledge and information, so...
Well, it depends on who's asking.
Yeah. Well, I know that you have some wonderful things to share with our viewing audience. For you at home today, we are speaking about family, and our first topic is pornography. This is something that is very rampant in our culture and our society, and some people may not want to hear about it and they may not want to face the reality, but it's something that is very prominent, especially in the family unit. Why is pornography so emotionally dangerous to people?
Well, the problem with pornography is that it appeals to our basic urges, essentially our God-given necessities. Food, you have to eat, you have to breathe. And people have innate desires, love, companionship, life fulfillment, and sensuality. And the danger of pornography is that it appeals to your basic needs as a human, and there's nothing wrong with sexuality or sensuality. The problem with pornography is that it damages it, it warps it. And it's a leading cause for divorce in the United States now. It's one of the top 10 reasons people get divorced is pornography in the home.
Why do you think it contributes so much to the divorce rate?
Well, the concept of pornography is entertainment, and it's fabrication. It's not real. And people that start on pornography usually start right around the age of 11 is when their first exposure is to it.
Wow.
And it gives the person a skewed or an inappropriate assessment of human sexuality, and it causes people to have unrealistic desires and expectations later on in life, particularly when they get into relationships and particularly marriage. It's now one of the top 5 reasons people get divorced. Wow. If somebody's a porn addict, the other spouse considers it adultery. And realistically, it is adultery, even though there may be no physical contact involved. It's an issue of the heart.
I wanted to get into what it leads to, but you mentioned 11. Is that something that...
Statistically, that's the first time that people are exposed to pornography now. Yes.
How are they exposed to it? I'm assuming through the computer, through
that's the number one
family?
Way. That's
maybe if another family member does it?
It's the internet pornography. It's literally swept the world, where America is number 4 in consumption of pornography. The Asian countries are number 1, China, South Korea, Japan. And America also is the number 1 producer of pornography. We produce more pornography than any country in the world.
Wow. So it's an epidemic.
It's an epidemic. It's kind of like a biblical plague.
So something that it's something that at 11 years old, have you found that if a father or even a mother, I'm assuming both sexes have problems with this?
Both sexes.
Is it something that can follow into the next generation? Does it seem to be a generational thing? If a child sees a parent doing it, are they more prone to do it or not to do it? There's
no question about it, because it appeals to that innate desire of the person, and it gets a hook in them, particularly when they're young. For example, I'm a senior citizen now, and when I was young, nobody had hardcore pornography. And you had television shows like Lucy, and the parents lived they slept in separate beds. Now, with the click of a computer, 2 clicks on a mouse, an 11 or 12-year-old child is exposed to hardcore pornography. And by the time they go through puberty and then get into serious relationships, they have a skewed view of sensuality and a skewed view of expectations of how that relationship's to play out. There isn't a husband or a wife in the world that can fulfill the expectations of a spouse who's been watching pornography regularly, because that's all fantasy. It's not real. And nobody can act like that or be that way on a consistent basis. It's just like watching Star Wars. It's not real. The pornographic industry is there to provide entertainment for the people, not in sexuality and human instruction.
So if you think of it as Hollywood in essence, but for an adult theme, it's not realistic. It's not something that can be achievable by people. So.
Totally unrealistic.
So if you have a child and you are not partaking in pornography yourself, how do you address it with them? If you find a computer, what do you do with your child?
Well, that's usually easy to spot, because children that have been on pornography usually have a very mature view of sensuality, and they know about things that you're not supposed to know about until you're an adult. That's the first red flag. The second red flag is a change in behavior. Pornography has a strange effect on children. It causes them to become emotionally aggressive. It causes them to mature quickly. Kids nowadays who are 13 and 14 and 15 years old have knowledge and experience about things that I didn't have until I was in my 20s, when I was younger. And that's how the internet pornography and the computer has changed everyone's lives.
So if a parent starts to see those signs, what should they do?
Well, I do my best to try and get them to go see somebody, a counselor, a therapist, go to your doctor. Somebody's got to do a intervention of sorts, because if that goes on unrestrained, then you're running the risk of a youngster developing later into a common problem that we have now, which is sexual addiction.
Wow. So that's
pornography is almost every case of sexual addiction in the United States has a pornographic root.
And so this is something that affects husbands and wives and men and women. How does it affect them differently?
Well, it affects the males worse and more often than females. Most porn addicts are males. And most males view pornography differently. In their mind, initially, it's more of a recreational tool, but later on, the wife or the spouse or the significant other sees it as a violation. And that's when the relationship starts to deteriorate. Secondly, the females in the relationship, the males start to expect them to do things that are unrealistic sexually. And what they're doing is they're watching the videos, they're learning all these different techniques, and then they're asking their significant others to do that. No reasonable spouse can keep up with somebody who's acting in a porn video, because that's all unrealistic. It's not real.
So I'm assuming then the answer would be it's negative, but is it positive or negative for married couples to use it to benefit their sexual life and their sexuality?
Well, in my experience, my counseling practice, it's a negative, because it gives a person unrealistic expectations of the other spouse. Secondly, there's a psychiatric treatment method that we use called systematic desensitization, and that's a technique where someone has a phobia and you expose them to the phobia repeatedly in very short increments over a longer period of time. They gradually lose their exposure to it. Well, the reverse is also true. If you expose someone to something, sex, violence, whatever it is, and you repeatedly do that, particularly to a child, it becomes normal or mundane. So after it becomes normal and mundane, then the person has to have greater stimulation, greater excitement to receive the interest.
And so does spirituality help in the treatment process? What helps? What have you found works in the treatment process of this?
Well, a couple of things. The cooperation of the family, the intention and the motivation of the person that's got the porn addiction. And the American Psychological Association did a couple of surveys over the last decade, and they showed that people respond better in therapy and treatment if they're allowed to include spirituality in their development. So at the House of Healing, in my counseling practice, we always include spirituality. In our particular case, it's Christian, because it has a very helping effect on people overcoming their addictions, because there's a moral aspect to it, there's a comfort aspect to it, and there's a sense of that God cares and knows and loves, and that has been proven statistically to help the person overcome their addictions.
And the desensitization, that's something that I think really hits home a lot with this generation especially. We've become saturated. You don't even have to buy or rent pornography anymore to see things that you never would see before. How does that affect, and how do you draw the boundaries in your relationship, in your life, to know the difference between right and wrong, essentially, and what is too much, and how do you put expectations on your partner for that, and how do you communicate about it if they do happen to be involved in things like that?
Well, that's a long, tough question there, but
yeah.
The key issue is with the parents, it's the individual character of each individual parent that monitors what the child sees, what the child does, and so on. But in our country, this whole thing kind of got started years ago with Calvin Klein. Before he came along, sensuality and sexuality was not used in advertising that much. But when he started with Brooke Shields and his jeans, and from that moment on, everybody started to use essentially sex to sell anything, literally anything. Now everybody's so desensitized to it that when you see it now, what appeared to be appalling then now appears to be completely normal.
And so something that a lot of people, whether it's our viewers or whether it's people they know, that's become a lot more common is strip clubs. And that's something that doesn't seem to be viewed as much of a taboo as it used to be. I know people that are married couples that go together. Where is that acceptable? Is that something that is going to change your perception of the body, of what feelings it brings to you? Is that healthy for a husband and a wife to do together? Is that healthy to allow your husband to go do? Where do the boundaries fall on that?
Oh, now that's another tough question. Now, see, that depends on the couple, obviously, but in my experience, just my experience in counseling, it's detrimental because, once again, in a relationship, a nurturing relationship, it's different from exposing yourself to other people in that same venue. Pornography has an additional problem to it in some cases. It leads to other things. You mentioned exotic dancing, strip clubs, to use your term, or phone sex, different things people get involved in, escort services, and so on. Why? Because the original level of interest with pornography, you kind of get used to that, you become desensitized to it, so you need another
So it leads
stimulation.
to more of an interaction with people then.
It goes beyond personal interaction, exactly.
So it does create other issues.
Yeah, and that's how people end up living on the DL. They have office affairs. Wow. They get in all kinds of unusual sexual activity. It leads to all kinds of dysfunctional family issues.
So if somebody's watching and they're struggling with a porn addiction, that's something that probably is difficult for somebody to come out and say, I have a pornography addiction. What do you just have a short, it's probably embarrassing to them, especially if they're in a religious world or something of that nature. What is your word of encouragement to them, just a short word of encouragement, if they are struggling with that or have a family member that is?
Well, the word of encouragement is two things. What I do at the counseling center is provide an environment that's non-judgmental. So if a person comes in for help, nobody's going to condemn them for their situation. Secondly, people can be cured of pornography addictions. It's a curable illness. Through counseling and therapy and spirituality, people can be healed of it. Thirdly, it's something that can be forgiven by the other spouse. So if someone's married and they have a pornography issue, eventually, either initially or later on, I need to involve both spouses to work through each separate issue together and reestablish that bond. I've seen many people healed of pornography addictions.
That's wonderful. Well, so it's good for people to know they're not alone if they're struggling with it or have a family member there's a lot of people that go through this. So.
Yes, a lot of people.
If you have any questions, I know that Michael would be happy to answer them. It is Michael W. Smith with the House of Healing, 602-636-5800, and the website is hardcorechristianity.com. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this first segment. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back after this short message.
I made a promise to my family that I would start taking better care of myself.
You have many reasons to stay healthy. Exercise and physical activity can help. So the National Institute on Aging at NIH, part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, created Go for Life.
I now exercise 3 times a week.
Featuring exercises you can do anywhere.
I can really go.
Find out more. Visit nia.nih.gov/go4life.
Hello and welcome back to Joy in Our Town. I'm your host, Vanessa Rose. If you just happen to be joining us today, we are here with Michael W. Smith, and he is a counselor, and he is from here in the Valley. He is with House of Healing. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
My pleasure.
Thank you for staying with us to join us for the second segment. We just covered pornography as it attributes to family and health, and also now our second topic is clinical depression. This is another very common thing in the world.
Extremely.
As a matter of fact, you gave me a statistic of how many people, of how common it is. How common is depression?
It's the #1 disabling condition in the country. It's ahead of cancer and heart disease.
Wow. And so it's another epidemic.
Yeah, another epidemic.
That's taking over our country, our world, really. What is the difference first between clinical depression, and dysthymia?
Well, the depression is a normal thing. Every human being at some time in their life is going to be depressed, and it's not mental illness, it's not a sickness. For example, if you know someone that you deeply love and care about and they die, or they're in a car accident, or they're hurt, there's going to be a natural period of grieving, and there's going to be a natural period of depression. That's perfectly normal. Where it becomes a problem, particularly with dysthymia, that's a condition that lasts for at least a year or two, and it's kind of like when I was a kid, there was a comic strip called Peanuts. And there was a character in that comic strip called Pigpen. And everywhere he went, he had this cloud over him. And that's what dysthymia is. It's a kind of a gloom that comes over someone after they have a traumatic event, and they essentially never recover from it. And if the depression lasts for a long period of time, that's when the person needs to seek help. Clinical depression is the bottom end of dysthymia. That's when the condition is so severe, you've got a patient or a person that's having difficulty working, getting out of bed, performing their activities of daily living, anything. It begins to, in a way, consume them. And that's when they've got to get some help.
But clinical depression doesn't only have to be brought on by a trauma. It can be just life.
Yes.
What are some of the main causes of clinical depression?
Well, in my experience, there's a couple of them. The first one we mentioned was trauma. Something bad happened, and every human being has that. If you're a human, you're going to have to face it. Mm-hmm. We all do. But the major contributor to it, believe it or not, is dysfunctional families. What I've seen is that if a child is raised in a dysfunctional family, that's kind of laying the groundwork for clinical depression later, because the person, as a youngster, develops this sense inside that they have low self-esteem or low self-worth, particularly when you have parents that argue and fight a lot in front of the children. And this low self-esteem allows the child to grow up with chronic negative thinking, poor conflict resolution skills, a sense of guilt and shame, or kind of a sense that they're at fault for what's going on around them. And this internal pain kind of sinks into the soul. And then later on in life, when they have to face everything their parents were facing, they're ill-equipped and incapable of handling it. And so many times they'll slip into long-term gloom, depression, dysthymia, or they'll actually have bouts of severe clinical depression when they can't function anymore. The problem with it is people are reluctant to come for help. Women are twice as likely to get clinical depression as males. And about 40% of women will come get help, which is low, but less than 5% of men will. So if somebody develops clinical depression, it's more likely a woman, but it's also more likely a woman that will come and get help. And people don't come and get help basically because they're embarrassed. For 2 reasons. A, they're embarrassed, or B, it's a financial concern. Most people feel kind of sense of a humiliation, or why do I have to go get help why can't I just pull myself up by my bootstraps? Once it develops into dysthymia or clinical depression, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps anymore. Just shake yourself out of it. It's too severe at that point.
Does it affect marriages, clinical depression? How does it affect a husband and a wife if one of the spouses have it? How do you
Depression is
deal
one of the
with
major
that?
problems in marriages, one of the major problems. And the key to it, if it's clinical depression, is this spouse can't function anymore. So at one time you had a unit or a team members that both worked together. Now you've got one carrying the load of the family. And the stress on the spouse that doesn't have clinical depression is enormous.
So how does a couple deal with that? How do you?
Well, the first case is you have to get them to come in for help, which is hard to do.
Wow, that's unfortunate that would be a hindrance for people. There's treatment, and then there's also there's a lot of drugs out there that people take. What is your take on how that affects people mentally, and does it benefit, or I'm sure there's different cases, but just in a general scenario?
Well, the key with medications and depression, it's somewhat similar to a kind of a crapshoot at the casino. What the doctor's doing is not trying to cure the depression. The physician is trying to find the right combination to help them through the period of depression, is what they're doing. And that's very tricky because each patient responds differently to different kinds of medication. There's about 10 psychotropic medications for depression. So if you don't get the combination just right, you're going to have more negative symptoms in the patient than you had from the clinical depression. And that's very common. I see that all the time.
Wow, so it's hit or miss. So
But
there
there's
has to
sometimes,
be,
if you get the combination right, it does help the person.
but it's hit, you don't know.
You don't know. It's,
You don't-
it's kind of like a guinea pig. The doctor gives them this series, and if that doesn't work, then they'll switch it to that one, and they kind of work their way through it. But in that period of time there, they really need some help with counseling and therapy, because that can be very stressful and very painful trying to adjust your medication load.
If somebody feels that their whole life they haven't been one way, and they kind of started to feel just down and out and are afraid that they may be getting there, but they know that they're not to that point, what can they do in their life to help bring themselves back up and to shake it off before it becomes something more severe?
What you're talking about there is kind of preventative maintenance, okay? And then the normal things there that everybody does for preventative maintenance works with pre-depression. You know, having a good support system, having friends, having hobbies, exercising, not taking illegal drugs, okay, not overdoing the diet. All those different things factor into what you just
So
said.
health has a big effect then.
Whole health has a big effect on it.
Being that it's the #1 disabling condition in the U.S. now, I wonder if there's some sort of correlation, or if you know, between obesity and that, and health and depression?
Well, obesity is another show. But obesity is a symptom of a deep-seated emotional issue. They can't bifurcate the two. When I see in a counseling session, when I'm working with somebody that's obese, the actual eating activity is not the problem. It's the emotional issue that's triggering it. And that usually trails back to childhood or young adulthood.
Goodness.
And it's usually a self-esteem issue. It's usually a parental dysfunctional training issue. Something happened, or it's usually childhood trauma.
Well, then we'll have to have you come back.
That's it.
Come back and speak about obesity. He's just a book of information. That's something that the few times I've got to sit down with Michael, he always has so much quality, good information to share. How does spirituality help in the treatment process of depression?
Well, it's been documented and it's helped. The American Psychological Association has done 2 surveys on that. And they showed clinically that people that include spirituality in their treatment process, that's included in medication, counseling, therapy, family therapy, marriage counseling. If they include spirituality, and at the House of Healing we use Christian spirituality, but they've proven that the results are improved and they're better. It's actually an asset to include that.
So it is beneficial to people and probably also to maintain a spiritual relationship. Do relationships with people, our marriage, can that create symptoms of depression if we're in a negative relationship, negative friendships? How does that affect bringing depression into your life?
Well, that's major, because the person that you're with may be the trigger for it.
How do you know if that person...
Well, in a counseling session, you have to kind of trail back through their lives. You know, everybody, kind of like footprints on the beach. Everybody from the time they're born leaves those little prints in the sand. And you have to trail back through that life and pick out spots where they were extremely wounded, extremely hurt, major disappointment areas, could be physical trauma. In our society, with the prevalence of sexual abuse and child abuse, that's usually the end game. That's usually where it starts.
And one more thing I want to ask was alcohol. Does alcohol trigger depression? And also, is that a symptom to watch for with a loved one if they start to drink a lot? So I guess it's a two-part question.
That was, and the first one is no, not normally.
Okay.
If somebody's a social drinker or something of that nature, they're not normally going to start developing depression. However, if someone is a heavy drinker, that's normally the symptoms of depression. That's usually a response to it. So if somebody's suffering from depression for a temporary period of time while they're drunk or high or on drugs or whatever it is, they do tend to feel emotionally a little better. But the problem with that is once the self-medication process ends, the depression tends to go up. So it's this vicious cycle. So alcohol and drugs is an exacerbator to clinical depression and dysthymia.
Therefore, drug abusers are born and that those symptoms begin. You become an alcoholic, you become a drug abuser.
Correct.
Because it's a self-medication.
Yes.
Wow. Well, it seems, just hearing what you're saying, there's so many things that trigger issues in our life, and we need to keep ourselves healthy spiritually and physically and keep good relationships in our life. And I know that if you have any questions, Michael would be happy to answer them. It is Michael W. Smith. He is with the House of Healing. The number is 602-636-5800, and the website is hardcorechristianity, all one word spelled out, .com. Thank you so much again, Michael, for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you. I know that you've been on before, and our viewing audience always enjoys everything you have to say. We look forward to seeing you here next time on Joy in Our Town. And remember to be happy and joyful, and hopefully this brings some joy into your town, and love your family and your loved ones. And don't be afraid to go find help, because you're not alone. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you here next time on Joy in Our Town.
This program has been sponsored by the Trinity Broadcasting Network and made possible by your telephone dollars. Your continual support can keep Joy in Our Town brought to your home every day. So write Joy in Our Town, P.O. Box A, Santa Ana, California, 92711.